The hematologist at Providence Alaska Medical Center told me there had been a mistake with my blood sample. This was on March 17, 2006, 11 days after I'd been airlifted off a mountain in the Talkeetna Range with a compound fracture of my left femur and internal bleeding that nearly killed me before the helicopter even touched down in Anchorage. I was still in the hospital, still on enough morphine that the edges of the room looked soft, and I remember thinking that a lab mistake made perfect sense because everything about the previous 2 weeks had felt like a mistake, like reality had glitched and forgotten how things were supposed to work. The hematologist's name was Dr. Sarah Chen. She was young, maybe 35, with the kind of tired eyes that hospital doctors get after too many overnight shifts, and she sat down in the chair next to my bed, holding a manila folder that looked too thin to contain anything important. She asked me if I was comfortable talking, which should have been my first warning that this conversation was not going to be about a simple lab error. I told her I was comfortable enough, which was a lie, but you don't spend 6 years working wilderness emergency medicine in Alaska without learning how to function through pain. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 sheets of paper covered in numbers and abbreviations that meant nothing to me. Lab results, blood work, the standard panel they run when you come into an ER hemorrhaging from a fall that should have killed you. She said they'd run my blood 4 times. I asked why 4 times was necessary, and she said because the first 3 times had produced results that were not medically possible, and the 4th time had confirmed that the results were consistent, which meant either their equipment was catastrophically malfunctioning or I was not genetically what I appeared to be. I was still processing the phrase "not genetically what I appeared to be" when she started talking about chromosomes. She said human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Everyone knows this. It's basic biology. 23 from your mother, 23 from your father, 46 total. She said my blood showed 23 pairs, which was correct, but the structure of several chromosomes in my genome contained sequences that did not match any known human genetic markers in the medical database. Not rare markers, not unidentified markers, markers that were fundamentally incompatible with Homo sapiens as a species. I asked her what that meant in plain English, and she said it meant that according to the lab results sitting in her folder, approximately 11% of my DNA was not human. My name is Marcus White River, though White River is not the name I was born with. My mother changed it legally when I was 7 years old for reasons she never fully explained, and I never pushed her on it because my mother was a woman who made decisions the way glaciers move, slowly, inevitably, and without offering explanations to anyone. I am 34 years old. I was born in Fairbanks, Alaska on November 3rd, 1971, and I have lived my entire life within 200 miles of that city, most of it in places where the population density is measured in people per square mile rather than square mile per person. I grew up in a cabin outside a town called Nenana that had 300 residents, 1 general store, and a volunteer fire department that my stepfather ran for 18 years. My mother, whose name was Elizabeth Whiteriver, born Elizabeth Marrow before she changed it, worked as a bookkeeper for the Alaska Railroad and spent her evenings sewing parkas and mukluks that she sold at craft fairs in Fairbanks and Anchorage. She was Athabascan on her mother's side, or so she told me, though I never met my grandmother, and my mother's stories about her family were sparse and contradictory, the kind of stories that feel more like placeholders than memories. She was a small woman, 5'3", with black hair she wore in a single braid down her back, and a face that looked carved from something harder than bone. She could dress a moose, fix a snow machine engine, and navigate by stars in weather that would kill most people, and she did all 3 with the same calm efficiency that made you believe she had been born knowing how. She married my stepfather, Dennis White River, when I was 4 years old. Dennis was white, a transplant from Oregon who had come to Alaska in the 1960s to work on the pipeline and never left. He was a good man, steady and kind, and he raised me like I was his own blood, which is a phrase that carries more weight now than it did when I was a kid who just wanted a father who showed up. My mother died in November of 1999 from ovarian cancer that she refused to treat until it was too late to matter. She was 53. She died at home in the cabin in Nenana with Dennis and me sitting beside her bed, and her last words to me were not "I love you" or "take care of yourself" or any of the things people are supposed to say when they are dying. Her last words were, "You are exactly what you were supposed to be." I thought she was talking about me being a paramedic, which was the career I had chosen after spending my early 20s working seasonal jobs on fishing boats and in logging camps and deciding I wanted to do something that mattered in a way I could measure. I thought she meant I had found my purpose. I did not know until 2006 that she might have meant something else entirely. I became an EMT in 2001. The training was 6 months in Anchorage, followed by a year working on an ambulance in Fairbanks, followed by a certification in wilderness emergency medicine that allowed me to work in remote areas where the nearest hospital could be hours away by helicopter and weather could turn a routine rescue into a survival situation without warning. By 2006, I was working for a private search and rescue outfit based out of Talkeetna that contracted with the National Park Service, the Alaska State Troopers, and anyone else who needed people pulled off mountains or out of rivers or extracted from situations where being alive was a temporary condition that required immediate intervention. I loved the work. It was hard and cold and dangerous, and it required you to make decisions in environments where there was no room for hesitation or second-guessing, and I was good at it in a way I had never been good at anything else. On March 6, 2006, I was part of a 4-person team dispatched to retrieve an injured climber from a slope on the western face of Mount Foraker. Foraker is the second highest peak in the Alaska Range, 17,400 feet of granite and ice that kills people with the kind of regularity that makes you wonder why anyone bothers trying to climb it. The climber we were sent to retrieve was a German tourist named Helmut Kraus, who had fallen during a solo ascent and radioed for help with a sat phone before losing consciousness. The weather was marginal, winds gusting to 40 miles per hour, visibility less than a quarter mile, temperature at the elevation where Kraus had fallen estimated at 15 below zero before wind chill. The helicopter pilot, a man named Roy Hendricks, who had been flying in Alaska longer than I had been alive, said the window for extraction was maybe 90 minutes before the weather turned completely and we would have to abort. We flew in at 1300 hours. The plan was simple. Roy would hold the helicopter in a hover as close to the slope as he could manage. I would rappel down with a litter and medical gear, stabilize Kraus, package him for transport, and we would winch both of us back up. Standard high-altitude rescue. I had done it 24 times in conditions worse than this. I rappelled down. The slope was steep, maybe 50 degrees, a mix of snow and exposed rock with ice underneath that made every step feel like it was testing whether physics was still in effect. I found Kraus 40 feet below the helicopter, unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, left leg bent at an angle that told me the femur was broken and probably the tibia too. I stabilized his neck, checked his airway, started an IV line, and radioed up to Roy that we were ready for the litter. That is when the wind hit. It came from the west, a gust that felt like a wall of frozen concrete, and it shoved the helicopter 15 feet sideways in less than a second. Roy corrected, overcorrected, and the skid clipped an outcrop of rock that I had not seen, and he had not seen because the visibility was deteriorating faster than either of us had anticipated. The helicopter lurched, the skid bent. Roy pulled up hard to avoid a full collision, and the sudden altitude change snapped the rappel line I was still clipped to. I fell, not far, maybe 20 feet down the slope, but on a 50-degree incline covered in ice. 20 feet is enough to accelerate you to a speed where stopping becomes a question of whether you hit something that kills you or something that only breaks you. I hit a rock, a granite boulder the size of a refrigerator that was buried halfway in the snow, and I hit it with my left side at what I later learned was approximately 30 miles per hour. I felt my femur snap. I felt ribs crack. I felt something inside my abdomen rupture in a way that flooded my pelvis with a heat that I knew was blood. And I remember thinking with the kind of clarity that only comes when you are absolutely certain you are about to die, that this was a stupid way to go. Roy got the helicopter stable. The team got a line down. They hauled me up in a litter with Kraus strapped in beside me, both of us broken, both of us bleeding, and they flew us to Anchorage at a speed that Roy later told me violated every safety protocol the FAA had ever written. Kraus survived. I survived. But the survival came with a cost, which was 11 days in a hospital bed, 2 surgeries to repair my femur and stop the internal bleeding, a transfusion of 4 units of blood because I had lost nearly 40% of my blood volume on that mountain, and a follow-up appointment with a hematologist who sat down next to my bed and told me that my blood contained genetic sequences that were not human. Dr. Chen did not use the word alien. She did not use the word hybrid. She used medical terminology that I did not understand, and when I asked her to stop talking like a textbook and tell me what she actually thought was happening, she closed the folder and said that in her professional opinion, either the lab had experienced a contamination event that had affected 4 separate blood samples in identical ways, which was statistically implausible, or I was a carrier of genetic material that had no documented origin in any human population on Earth. She said the markers were not primate. They were not mammalian in the sense that matched any known species. The closest analog she could find in the genetic database was a reference sequence from a study done in the 1990s on unidentified hair samples collected in the Pacific Northwest, samples that had been dismissed by the broader scientific community as contaminated or misidentified, but that shared structural similarities with what she was seeing in my blood. I asked her what kind of hair samples. She said the samples had been submitted as potential evidence of a cryptid species. She did not say Bigfoot. She did not have to. I could see it in her face, in the way she was looking at me like I was a problem she did not know how to solve, a data point that violated the rules of the world she had been trained to understand. I told her that was insane. She agreed that it was insane. She also said the blood work was consistent across 4 tests. The contamination hypothesis did not hold up under scrutiny, and unless I had a better explanation for why my chromosomes contained sequences that did not match Homo sapiens, insane was going to have to be the working theory until something more plausible presented itself. I did not have a better explanation. I had a mother who was dead and a stepfather who was not my biological father, and a childhood that had been marked by a woman who never talked about her family and who had changed her last name when I was 7 for reasons that suddenly felt less arbitrary than they had when I was a kid. Dr. Chen said she wanted to run more tests. She wanted to bring in a geneticist from the University of Alaska. She wanted to document this because if the results were real, if they held up under peer review, this was the kind of discovery that rewrote biology textbooks. I told her no. I told her I needed time to think, and I needed her to keep this quiet, and I needed her to not turn me into a case study or a research paper or a headline in a journal that would make me the most famous genetic anomaly in modern medicine. She said she understood, but I could tell from the way she said it that she did not agree. She gave me copies of the lab results. She gave me the name of a geneticist in Anchorage who specialized in unusual hereditary conditions and who she said could be discreet if discretion was what I wanted. And then she left, and I was alone in a hospital room with a folder full of paper that said I was 11% something that should not exist. I was discharged on March 21st. My leg was in a cast from hip to ankle. I had a prescription for painkillers and a follow-up schedule with an orthopedic surgeon who told me I would need physical therapy for at least 6 months and that my days of rappelling off helicopters were probably over. I went back to Nenana. Dennis picked me up from the airport in Fairbanks, and we drove the 50 miles to the cabin in silence because Dennis was not a man who filled silence with small talk, and I was not in a state of mind to pretend that anything about the past 3 weeks had been normal. The cabin looked the same. It always looked the same. A single-story structure with a metal roof and log walls that Dennis had chinked and rechinked every few years to keep the wind out. There was a wood stove in the main room, a generator in the shed out back, and a view from the front porch that looked across the Tanana River Valley toward a horizon that seemed to go on forever. I had grown up in this cabin. I had learned to hunt and fish and survive in country that did not forgive mistakes, and I had left at 18 believing I knew everything I needed to know about who I was and where I came from. I sat on the porch that first night back, leg propped up, morphine keeping the pain at a manageable roar, and I looked at the folder Dr. Chen had given me. The lab results were technical, dense, full of terms like heterozygous loci and mitochondrial haplotypes and nucleotide polymorphisms that meant nothing to me. But buried in the third page of the report was a sentence that I read 5 times before I understood what it was saying. Maternal lineage markers show no match to established human mitochondrial haplogroups. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child. It does not recombine like nuclear DNA. It is a direct line, an unbroken genetic thread that traces back through your mother, her mother, all the way to the beginning. If my mitochondrial DNA did not match human haplogroups, that meant my mother's mitochondrial DNA had not matched, which meant my mother, Elizabeth White River, born Elizabeth Marrow, who had told me she was Athabascan, who had raised me in a cabin in the interior of Alaska and died telling me I was exactly what I was supposed to be, had been carrying genetic material that was not human, and she had passed it to me. I went inside. Dennis was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, reading a book about the history of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that he had read at least 4 times before. I sat down across from him and I put the folder on the table, and I said I needed to ask him about my mother. He looked at the folder but did not touch it. He said, "What about her?" I said I needed to know about her family, her biological family, where she came from before she came to Nenana. He closed the book. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at me with an expression that was tired and sad, and somehow not surprised, and he said, "Your mother made me promise not to talk about that." I said, "She's dead. The promise does not hold anymore." He said promises to the dead hold longer than promises to the living, and I was not going to get him to break this one unless I gave him a reason that mattered more than his word. I opened the folder. I showed him the lab results. I showed him the sentence about maternal lineage markers. I told him what Dr. Chen had said, and I watched his face as I talked, and I saw something I had never seen in Dennis White River in 26 years of knowing him. I saw fear. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the river valley, and he stood there for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Your mother was adopted." I said, "I know that." She told me she was adopted when I was a kid. He said she was not adopted the way you think. She was not adopted through an agency or a state program. She was found. I asked what that meant, found, and he turned around and looked at me, and he said it meant exactly what it sounds like. Someone found her in the woods when she was an infant, and they brought her to a village, and a family took her in, and no one ever figured out where she came from or who her parents were, because there was no record of her birth and no missing persons report, and no explanation for how a baby could be alive in the middle of the Alaska wilderness in January, with no shelter and no caretakers and no frostbite. He said this happened in 1946. The village was a small Athabascan community on the Koyukuk River, about 200 miles northwest of Fairbanks. The man who found her was a trapper named William Marrow, and he found her in a lean-to shelter made of spruce boughs and moss, wrapped in a fur that he said looked like bear hide but was too fine and too well tanned to be anything a human would have made without tools. The baby was maybe 2 months old. She was healthy. She was not crying. And when William picked her up, she looked at him with eyes that he later described as too aware, too calm, like she understood what was happening in a way that no infant should. William brought her to the village. The elders debated what to do. There were stories in that part of Alaska, old stories about people who went into the deep woods and came back changed, or did not come back at all, and about things that lived in the mountains that were not animals and not spirits, but something in between. The elders said the baby was a gift or a test, and either way, she was to be raised as one of their own, and no one was to speak of where she came from, because speaking of it might invite attention from whatever had left her there. William and his wife, Martha, raised her. They named her Elizabeth. She grew up in the village until she was 17, and then she left, the way young people leave small places, and she came to Nenana, and she met Dennis, and she built a life that looked normal on the surface, but that carried underneath it a question she never answered. Dennis said your mother knew she was different. She did not know how or why, but she knew. She was stronger than she should have been. She could see in the dark better than anyone he had ever met. She could track game in snow that should not have held prints, and she could move through the woods without making sound in a way that was not learned, it was instinctual. He said when I was born, she held me for the first time and cried. And when he asked her why she was crying, she said because I looked human, and she had been afraid I would not. I asked him if he believed the stories, the ones about things in the woods. He said he did not believe them until he met my mother, and then he believed them because there was no other explanation that made sense. He said when she got sick, when the cancer was taking her and she knew she was dying, she told him that if I ever started asking questions about where she came from, he was to tell me the truth, but only if I asked. She said I would know when it was time to know, and until then, the not knowing would protect me. He said, I guess it is time. I left Nenana the next morning. I told Dennis I needed to go to the Koyukuk, to the village where my mother had been found, and he said the village was not there anymore. It had been abandoned in the 1970s when the younger generation moved to Fairbanks and Anchorage for work, and the old people died and the buildings were left to rot. He said there was nothing there now but foundations and memories. I said I needed to see it anyway. He gave me directions, a map with hand-drawn notations showing the river route and the trail that led to the site. He said, "Be careful," and he said it in a way that made it clear he was not talking about the terrain. The drive from Nenana to the Koyukuk took 2 days. I had to take it slow because of my leg, and the roads in that part of Alaska are not roads so much as suggestions of where a vehicle might go if the driver is brave or stupid enough to try. I stayed overnight in a camp near Bettles, and I continued north the next morning, following the river drainage until the map told me I was close. I parked the truck at a pull-off where the trail started, and I walked. My leg was still in the cast, and walking on uneven ground with crutches was slow and painful and deeply impractical. But I was not going to drive 300 miles and turn around because the last mile was hard. The trail followed the river for about 2 miles, then turned east into a stand of black spruce and birch that had grown so thick over the decades that the path was barely visible. I found the village site just before dusk. Dennis had been right. There was nothing left but foundations, square outlines of rot-resistant logs that had once been the base of cabins, a collapsed cache platform, a clearing that might have been a communal area. The forest was taking it back, the way the forest takes back everything in Alaska if you leave it alone long enough. I stood in the clearing as the light faded, and I tried to imagine my mother here as a child, running between the cabins, learning to set snares and tan hides, and navigate by the stars. I tried to imagine William Merrow finding a baby in a lean-to shelter in the middle of January and deciding to bring her home instead of leaving her to die, which would have been the easier choice and the one most people would have made. I tried to imagine what kind of desperation or love or incomprehensible circumstance would lead someone to leave an infant in the woods, wrapped in a fur that was too fine to be bare, and I could not imagine any of it because the variables were too strange, the outcome too impossible. I set up camp. I had brought a tent and a sleeping bag and enough food for 3 days, which was longer than I planned to stay, but long enough to account for the possibility that I might find something worth staying for. I built a fire in the clearing, and I sat next to it as the temperature dropped and the stars came out. And I thought about Dr. Chen's lab results and Dennis's story and my mother's last words. "You are exactly what you are supposed to be." At some point after midnight, I heard something in the trees. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. The forest in Alaska is never completely quiet. There are always birds, insects, small mammals moving through the underbrush, wind in the branches. But the sound that had been there when I set up camp was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I looked into the tree line. The fire was burning low, and the light it cast did not reach far, maybe 10 feet. And beyond that was darkness so thick it looked solid. I did not see anything, but I felt something, a presence, a weight in the air that made the hair on my arms stand up and my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Something was watching me. I said hello. My voice sounded small in the silence. There was no answer. I said, "My name is Marcus White River. My mother was Elizabeth White River. She was found here when she was a baby in 1946. I am trying to understand where she came from." Still no answer, but the silence shifted. It was still there, still absolute, but it felt less like a void and more like a held breath, like something was listening. I said, "If you know anything about her, if you remember her, I need to know. I need to understand what I am." The fire popped. A log split and sent up a spray of sparks that rose into the darkness and disappeared. And from somewhere in the trees, maybe 50 feet away, maybe 100, I heard a sound. It was low, resonant, a hum that vibrated in my chest like the lowest note on a pipe organ. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then it stopped, and the forest stayed silent. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the fire and fed it wood and waited for the sound to come again, but it did not. When the sun came up, I searched the tree line. I found tracks. They were in a patch of soft ground near the edge of the clearing, 15 feet from where I had been sitting. The tracks were barefoot, human-shaped, but enormous. Each print was 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot, pressed deep into the earth with a weight that I estimated at somewhere north of 400 pounds. There were 3 prints in a line, evenly spaced, heading north into the spruce. I followed them. I should not have. My leg was broken, I was alone, and I was following something that had left tracks twice the size of my own into terrain that got rougher with every step. But I followed them anyway because those tracks were the first tangible evidence I had that the lab results were not a mistake, that my mother's story was real, that I was not losing my mind. The tracks led through the spruce for about a quarter mile, then disappeared at the edge of a creek where the ground turned to bedrock. I stood at the water's edge and looked upstream, downstream across to the other side. Nothing. No more tracks. No signs of passage. No indication of where the thing that made those prints had gone. I went back to camp, packed my gear, and drove back to Nenana, and I did not tell Dennis what I had found because I did not know how to explain it in a way that would make sense. I spent the next 2 weeks reading everything I could find about unidentified hominids in North America. There was more material than I expected. Sightings, reports, footprint casts, hair samples, all of it dismissed by mainstream science as misidentification or hoax or wishful thinking. But buried in the noise were a few cases that stood out. A hair sample from the Kiamichi Mountains in Oklahoma, analyzed in 1995, that showed primate characteristics but did not match any known ape species. A tissue sample from British Columbia in 2003 that contained mitochondrial DNA sequences with no match in the genetic databases. A footprint cast from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington that showed dermal ridges inconsistent with human or bear anatomy. None of it was definitive. All of it was contested. But the pattern was there, a thread of genetic anomalies and unexplained physical evidence that pointed to something living in the deep woods of North America that was close enough to human to be mistaken for one at a distance, but different enough that close examination revealed the cracks in the illusion. I contacted the geneticist Dr. Chen had recommended. His name was Dr. Robert Vance, and he worked out of a private lab in Anchorage that specialized in what he called edge case genetics, which I later learned was a polite way of saying he took on cases that other geneticists would not touch because they were too weird or too controversial or too likely to damage a reputation. I met him in his office on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. The office was small, cluttered with papers and books, and what looked like a human skeleton in the corner that turned out to be a teaching model from a medical school. Dr. Vance was in his 60s, gray-haired, with the kind of face that suggested he had spent a lot of time squinting at things under microscopes and not enough time outside. He looked at my lab results for about 10 minutes without saying anything, and then he looked at me and asked if I had any living relatives on my mother's side. I told him no. My mother was an only child. Her adoptive parents were dead, and I had no information about her biological family beyond the story Dennis had told me. He asked if I would consent to a full genetic workup, not just blood work, but a comprehensive mapping of my genome, mitochondrial DNA analysis, and a comparison against every reference database he had access to, which he said included some sources that were not exactly public. I asked him what that meant, not exactly public, and he said it meant he had contacts in research institutions who shared data off the record, data from studies that had not been published because the results were too anomalous to survive peer review, too strange to be taken seriously by the academic community, but too consistent to be completely dismissed. He said if my lab results were accurate, I was not the first case he had seen. There had been others. Not many, maybe a dozen over the past 20 years, people who had shown up in emergency rooms or genetic counseling sessions or ancestry DNA testing with markers that did not fit the human genetic model. Most of them had been dismissed as lab errors. A few had been quietly studied and then quietly buried in filing cabinets because no one knew what to do with data that suggested human beings could interbreed with something that was not human. I agreed to the workup. Dr. Vance drew blood, took hair samples, swabbed the inside of my cheek, and told me to come back in 2 weeks. I spent those 2 weeks trying to live a normal life. I did physical therapy for my leg. I answered emails from my supervisor at the search and rescue outfit, asking when I would be cleared to return to work. I cooked meals, read books, and pretended that I was not waiting for a phone call that would tell me whether I was a genetic anomaly or whether the past month had been an elaborate mistake. The call came on April 20th. Dr. Vance said I needed to come to the lab immediately, and he said it in a tone that made it clear this was not a conversation he wanted to have over the phone. I drove to Anchorage. The lab was in a nondescript building near the university, the kind of place you would walk past 100 times without noticing. Dr. Vance met me in the lobby and led me to a conference room where he had spread out what looked like a small library of printouts and charts and images that I assumed were genetic sequences rendered in visual form. He said the results were consistent. Every test, every analysis, every comparison against known human populations came back with the same conclusion. Approximately 11% of my nuclear DNA and 17% of my mitochondrial DNA did not match Homo sapiens. The sequences were primate in structure, bipedal hominid markers, but they diverged from the human genetic tree at a point that predated modern humans by what he estimated to be at least 500,000 years. He said the divergence suggested a common ancestor, something that split off from the evolutionary line that led to Homo sapiens and went in a different direction, a direction that was still bipedal, still intelligent, still genetically compatible enough with humans to produce viable offspring, but distinct enough that the offspring carried markers that were identifiable under close genetic scrutiny. I asked him what he thought I was, and he said he thought I was exactly what the data suggested, which was the descendant of a hybridization event between a human and something else, something that lived in the forests of North America and had been there long enough to develop its own genetic signature, but not so isolated that it had lost the ability to interbreed with humans when the opportunity or necessity arose. He said the hybridization was not recent. The markers in my genome suggested the mixing had happened at least 2 or 3 generations back, possibly more, which meant my mother had inherited these sequences from her biological parents, and they had inherited them from theirs, and somewhere up the line, far enough back that the specifics were lost, a human and a non-human had produced a child, and that child had survived and reproduced, and the genetic legacy of that union had been passed down through enough generations that it had become diluted but not erased. He said I was not alone. The other cases he had seen, the ones that had been quietly documented and quietly ignored, showed similar patterns. People in remote areas, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and parts of the Northern Rockies, showing up with genetic markers that could not be explained by known human ancestry. People who were stronger than they should be, who had night vision better than baseline human capability, who could tolerate cold and altitude and physical stress in ways that suggested their biology was operating on a different set of parameters. People who looked human, who lived human lives, but who carried in their cells the evidence of something older, something that predated cities and agriculture and written language. Dr. Vance said the scientific community would never accept this. The data was too clean to be a mistake, but too impossible to be real, and the result was a stalemate where the evidence existed but could not be acknowledged because acknowledging it would require rewriting fundamental assumptions about human evolution and the nature of the species that share this continent with us. He said I had a choice. I could take the data and go public, try to force the conversation, become the face of a discovery that would make me famous and probably destroy my life in the process. Or I could take the data and keep it private, live with the knowledge but not the burden of proof. and let the secret stay a secret the way it had stayed a secret for generations. I took the data. I thanked Dr. Vance for his work. I drove back to Nenana and I put the folder in a drawer next to the folder Dr. Chen had given me. And I did not talk about it for a long time because I did not know what to say or who to say it to. My mother had been right. I was exactly what I was supposed to be, which was a bridge between two worlds, a living contradiction, a person whose existence challenged the boundaries of what science said was possible, but whose life depended on those boundaries staying in place. The secret lasted 6 months. I went back to work in July of 2006, after my leg healed enough to pass the physical fitness requirements for wilderness emergency response. My supervisor asked if I was ready to climb again, and I said I was, which was not entirely true, but was close enough to the truth that I could live with it. The truth was that my leg worked. My strength had come back faster than the physical therapist expected, and I could run 1.5 miles in under 11 minutes on terrain that most people would need 15 minutes to walk. The physical therapist said my recovery was remarkable. I did not tell her that remarkable was becoming the default setting for everything about my biology. I did not tell anyone. I returned to the mountains because the mountains were the only place that made sense anymore. In Fairbanks, in Anchorage, in any town large enough to have traffic lights and grocery stores, I felt like I was pretending to be something I was not. But in the backcountry, in the places where the tree line thinned and the ridges opened up and the only sound was wind and water and the occasional crack of a branch under something's weight, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The first time I felt it watching me was in August. I was on a solo training hike in the Alaska Range, running a route I had used 12 times before, a 12-mile loop that climbed 3,000 feet over rough terrain and required navigation skills that most recreational hikers did not have. I was moving fast, faster than I should have been able to move with a pack that weighed 40 pounds and boots that were designed for stability rather than speed. I stopped at a ridgeline to drink water and check my pace, and I felt the air change. It was not a sound. It was not a smell. It was a presence, a weight, the same feeling I had experienced at the abandoned village site on the Koyukuk. Something was near me. Something was watching. I turned slowly, scanning the slope below the ridge. The terrain was open, mostly tundra and low scrub, with scattered patches of willow and alder in the drainage below. There was nothing visible, no movement, no color that did not belong, no shape that registered as out of place. But the feeling persisted, and with it came something new. Recognition. Not the recognition of seeing someone you know, but the recognition of being seen by something that knows you, something that has been waiting for you to notice it. I said hello. My voice carried across the ridge and disappeared into the valley. No response. I said, my name is Marcus. My mother was Elizabeth Marrow. I think you knew her. The air shifted. A gust of wind came up from the valley, carrying with it a scent that I had never smelled before, but that triggered something deep in my brain, something primal and old. It smelled like earth and fur and something else, something organic but not quite animal, not quite human, the kind of smell that makes you understand why your ancestors built fires and stayed close to them after dark. I did not move. I stayed on the ridge with my pack still on and my water bottle still in my hand, and I waited. And after what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 10 minutes, I heard it. A sound from the drainage below. Low, resonant, the same kind of hum I had heard at the village site. It lasted maybe 3 seconds and then it stopped, and the wind shifted again and the presence was gone. I finished the hike. I did not tell anyone what had happened because I did not know how to explain it in a way that would not sound like altitude sickness or exhaustion or the early stages of a psychological break. But I knew what I had felt. and I knew it was not random. Whatever had been watching me on that ridge had been waiting for me, had known I would be there, had made itself known just enough to let me understand that I was not alone in these mountains, and that the connection I carried in my DNA was not a historical artifact. It was a living relationship. It happened again in September. A rescue call came in for a lost hiker near Denali. I was part of the response team, and we spent 2 days searching a drainage that was so thick with alder and devil's club that moving through it required machetes and patience and a willingness to get cut and bruised and soaking wet. We found the hiker on the 3rd day, dehydrated and hypothermic but alive, and we carried him out on a litter through terrain that should have taken 6 hours, but that we covered in 4 because I was in front-breaking trail, and I was moving at a pace that the other team members later described as inhuman. One of them, a guy named Carl, who had been doing wilderness rescue longer than I had been alive, pulled me aside after we reached the trailhead and asked me how I had moved that fast through brush, that thick. I told him, adrenaline. He said adrenaline does not explain seeing in the dark the way you were seeing. I asked him what he meant, and he said during the last hour of the hike, when the sun had set and we were navigating by headlamp, I had been calling out obstacles and changes in terrain before my headlamp beam reached them. He said it was like I was seeing 20 feet ahead in total darkness, and that was not something adrenaline explained. I told him he was imagining things. He looked at me the way you look at someone who is lying to you, but who you are not going to challenge because the lie is serving a purpose you do not understand. And he dropped it. But I knew he was right. I had been seeing in the dark. Not clearly, not the way you see in daylight, but enough to navigate, enough to avoid obstacles, enough to move through the forest at night with a confidence that did not come from experience or training. It came from biology, from genetic markers that were not human, from a mother who had been found in the woods as an infant and who had carried in her cells the legacy of something that had been living in these forests long before electric lights made darkness optional. In October, I went back to the Koyukuk. I told Dennis I was going on a solo camping trip, and he did not ask where because he already knew. He gave me a satellite phone and made me promise to check in every 24 hours. And then he watched me drive away with an expression that was part worry and part resignation. I drove north. The weather was turning. The first snow had fallen in the high country, and the leaves on the birch and aspen had gone yellow and orange and were starting to fall. The river was low, running clear over gravel bars that would be underwater by spring. I parked at the same pull-off I had used in March, and I walked the same trail to the abandoned village site, and I set up camp in the same clearing. I did not know what I was hoping for. Contact, maybe. Confirmation. Some kind of answer to the questions that had been building since the hospital, since the lab results, since my mother's death 7 years earlier. I built a fire as the light faded. The temperature was dropping fast, already below freezing, and the sky was clear and full of stars that looked close enough to touch. I sat by the fire and waited. The silence came first. The same absolute silence I had felt in March, the kind that presses on your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. And then the presence, closer this time. Not 50 feet away, maybe 20. I could feel it in the air, in the way the firelight seemed to stop at a certain distance, as if something was absorbing it. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the fire, and I said, I came back. I wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what my mother was, what I am. There was no response, but the presence did not leave. It stayed just beyond the edge of the firelight, and I could hear breathing, slow, deep, controlled, the breathing of something large and alive and watching. I said, I am not here to prove anything. I am not here to take pictures or collect evidence or tell anyone about you. I am here because I do not know Where else to go? The breathing stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the river. And then I heard movement. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. I kept my eyes on the fire. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to look, to see what was approaching. But I did not. I stayed still and I waited, and the footsteps stopped maybe 10 feet behind me. I could smell it now. The same scent from the ridge, earth and fur and something else. I could feel the heat of it, the body heat of something massive, standing close enough that if I reached back I could probably touch it. And then I felt something on my shoulder, a hand, not a paw, not a claw, a hand. The fingers were long, the palm was broad, and the weight of it was gentle, deliberate, the way you would place your hand on someone's shoulder to let them know you were there. I did not move, I did not breathe, and the hand stayed there for maybe 5 seconds, and then it lifted and the footsteps retreated, and the presence faded back into the trees. I sat by that fire until dawn. I did not sleep, I did not move. I just sat and processed what had happened, and what it meant, and the fact that I had just been touched by something that was not supposed to exist, but that had known my mother and had recognized me as her child. When the sun came up, I searched the area behind where I had been sitting. There were tracks, 4 of them, pressed deep into the soft ground near the edge of the clearing. Each print was 18 inches long, barefoot, humanoid, with toes that were longer and more articulated than human toes. The depth of the prints suggested a weight of at least 500 pounds, maybe more. I measured them, photographed them, and then I covered them with leaves because I did not want anyone else to find them. These tracks were not evidence, they were personal. They were a message intended for me, and I intended to keep them that way. I called Dennis from the sat phone. I told him I was fine, that I would be home in 2 days, and that I had found what I was looking for. He asked what I had found, and I said peace. He did not ask me to elaborate. Over the next 2 years, I went back to the Koyukuk site 11 times. Not all of the visits produced contact. Some nights I sat by the fire alone and felt nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. But other nights, the presence came. Sometimes it stayed at a distance just beyond the firelight, breathing and watching. Sometimes it came closer. Once, in the summer of 2007, it left something for me. A gift, I think, though I am still not entirely sure what it meant. It was a stone, smooth and round, about the size of a softball, placed on a flat rock near my tent while I was gathering firewood. The stone was quartzite, river-worn, and it had a warmth to it that suggested it had been carried for a long time, held in a hand that generated heat, the way large mammals generate heat. I kept the stone. It sits on my desk now, next to the folders from Dr. Chen and Dr. Vance, and sometimes when I am trying to make sense of everything that has happened, I hold it and feel its weight and remember that I am not making this up. In 2008, I made a decision. I could not keep doing wilderness rescue work without eventually telling someone what I was. The physical capabilities that came with my genetics were becoming too obvious. I was healing too fast, seeing too well in low light, tolerating cold and altitude in ways that my colleagues were starting to notice and comment on. Carl had stopped asking questions, but I could see the suspicion in his eyes every time we worked together. So I quit. I told my supervisor that I was burned out, that the injury on Foraker had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit, and that I needed a change. It was not entirely a lie. I was burned out, but not from the work. I was burned out from pretending to be normal. I moved to a cabin outside Talkeetna that I bought for $23,000 from a man who was moving to Arizona because he could not handle Alaska winters anymore. The cabin was small, 1 room with a loft, no running water, a wood stove for heat, and a view of the Alaska range that made every sunrise feel like a privilege. I took a job with the Park Service doing trail maintenance and backcountry patrol, work that kept me in the mountains but did not require me to perform in front of teams or explain why I could do things that other people could not. I lived alone. I liked it that way. Solitude in Alaska is not loneliness. It is clarity. It is the absence of noise and distraction and the presence of something older and more honest than human conversation. I spent my days hiking trails, clearing deadfall, checking campsites, and my evenings sitting on the porch of my cabin watching the light change on the mountains and thinking about my mother and the secret she had carried and the life she had built around it. She had known what she was. She had known, and she had chosen to live quietly, to raise a child, to work a normal job and sing in a church choir, and never once draw attention to the fact that she was different. She had protected me by not telling me, and she had trusted that when the time came, I would figure it out on my own. She had been right. In 2009, something changed. I was on a backcountry patrol in Denali, about 30 miles from the nearest road, when I found a campsite that should not have been there. It was not marked on any map. It was not a designated camping area. It was just a clearing in a stand of spruce with a fire ring made of stones and a lean-to shelter built from branches and moss that looked like it had been there for years. The fire ring was old, the ashes cold and scattered by wind and rain. But there were other signs. Footprints, large ones, around the perimeter of the clearing, and hanging from a branch near the shelter was something that made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. It was a necklace, handmade, strung on what looked like braided sinew with a pendant carved from bone. The carving was simple but deliberate, a spiral pattern that reminded me of the petroglyphs you find on rock faces in certain parts of Alaska, the ones that archaeologists say are thousands of years old and that depict symbols no one has been able to definitively interpret. I took the necklace down. It was light, the bone was smooth, and the sinew was still strong, not brittle. This had been made recently, maybe within the past year, and it had been left in a place where I would find it. I put it on. I do not know why. It felt right, felt like it was meant for me. I wore it back to my cabin, and I have worn it every day since. It sits under my shirt, against my skin, and sometimes when I am alone, I take it out and look at the spiral and wonder what it means. A claim, maybe, a mark of belonging, a way of saying you are one of us, even if you live in their world. In 2010, I met someone. Her name was Sarah, and she was a wildlife biologist studying caribou migration patterns in the Brooks Range. We met at a bar in Fairbanks, started talking about the mountains, and did not stop talking for 6 hours. She was smart, funny, comfortable in the wilderness in a way that most people are not, and she did not think it was strange that I lived in a cabin with no electricity and spent most of my time alone. We started dating. It was good. It was normal, or as normal as my life was capable of being. But I did not tell her. I could not tell her. How do you explain to someone you care about that you are genetically part something that is not supposed to exist? How do you bring that up in a conversation without sounding insane? So I kept it quiet, and we built a relationship around the parts of my life that I could share, and I told myself that was enough. It was not enough. She knew I was hiding something. She asked me about it once, directly, sitting on the porch of my cabin watching the sunset. She said, "You are keeping something from me, and I need to know if it is something that is going to hurt us." I told her it was not going to hurt us, but I could not talk about it. She asked why, and I said because if I told her, she would not believe me, and if she did believe me, it would change everything. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said, "I love you, but I cannot be with someone who has secrets that big." We broke up 2 weeks later. It was the right decision, and it hurt in a way that made me understand why my mother had never remarried after my stepfather died. Some things you cannot share. Some secrets are too heavy to put on another person. I went back to the Koyukuk the night after Sarah left. I did not tell Dennis. I just drove north, parked at the pull-off, walked to the clearing and sat by a fire that I built, too large and too hot because I needed the light to push back the darkness. I was angry, not at Sarah, at the situation, at the biology that made me different, at the mother who had died without explaining it, at the thing in the woods that had touched my shoulder and left me gifts, but that had never once shown itself fully, never once given me the clarity of a face or a voice or a name. I shouted into the trees. I said, I need more than this. I need to understand. I need to see you. The forest stayed silent. No presence, no breathing, no footsteps, just wind and the crackle of the fire and my own voice echoing back at me. I sat there until the fire burned down to coals, and then I walked back to my truck and drove home. I did not go back to the Koyukuk for 3 years. I told myself I was done. Done chasing ghosts, done trying to build a relationship with something that was never going to meet me halfway, done living half in the human world and half in a secret that I could not share. I focused on work, I hiked, I maintained trails, I patrolled the backcountry, and I tried to live a normal life. But normal did not fit anymore. It was like wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too small. I could make it work, but it was uncomfortable, restrictive, and every time I moved, I was reminded that I was forcing myself into something that was not designed for me. In October of 2013, Dennis called me. He said he needed to talk, and he needed to talk in person. I drove to Nenana. Dennis was 81 years old by then, still living in the cabin, still splitting his own firewood and maintaining his own generator, but I could see the age in him, in the way he moved more carefully, more slowly, as if he were negotiating with his body about how much longer it was going to cooperate. We sat on the porch. He handed me a box, small, wooden, about the size of a shoebox. He said, "Your mother left this for you. She told me to give it to you when you were ready, and I did not know when that would be, but I think it is now." I opened the box. Inside were letters, maybe 20 of them, written in my mother's handwriting on paper that had yellowed slightly with age. Each letter was sealed in an envelope with a date on the outside. The dates ranged from 1972 to 1998. I looked at Dennis. He said she wrote those over the years, things she wanted you to know but could not say out loud. She told me to keep them until you asked the right questions. You have been asking. I took the box home. I read the letters in order, sitting at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee that I did not drink and a window that looked out at the mountains where the sun was setting in a wash of pink and orange that made the peaks look like they were on fire. The letters were not long. Most were only a few pages, but they were detailed, specific, and they told me things about my mother's life that I had never known. She wrote about being found in the woods. She wrote about growing up in the village on the Koyukuk and knowing from a young age that she was different. She wrote about the night vision, the strength, the ability to move through the forest in ways that the other children could not. She wrote about the nightmares she had as a teenager, dreams of running through trees with something large and warm beside her, something that spoke in a language she did not understand but that felt like home. She wrote about the first time she went back to the site where William Marrow had found her. She was 16 and she went alone and she sat in the clearing for 2 days. And on the second night, something came. She described it. Not in clinical terms, not in the language of fear or wonder, but in the language of reunion. She said it was tall, maybe 8 feet, covered in reddish-brown hair that was coarse but clean, and its face was broad and flat, with eyes that were dark and deep and looked at her with an expression she could only describe as love. She said it did not speak, but it made sounds, low hums and clicks, and something that might have been a word or might have been her name. She said it touched her face with a hand that was twice the size of a human hand, and it was warm and gentle, and she was not afraid. She said she knew in that moment that this was her father, not in a legal sense, not in a way that any human court would recognize, but in the truest sense of the word. This was the being that had left her in a shelter made of spruce boughs, wrapped in a fur that would keep her warm, in a place where humans would find her and raise her because it could not raise her itself. She wrote that she saw it 3 more times over the next 20 years, once before she married Dennis, once when she was pregnant with me, and once a few months before she got sick. She said each time it appeared, it seemed older, more careful, more deliberate in its movements, as if it were carrying the weight of years that accumulated differently for its kind than for humans. She said the last time she saw it, it gave her something, a stone, smooth and warm, that it placed in her hand and then closed her fingers around. She said she kept that stone until the day she died, and it was buried with her because it was not meant for anyone else. In the final letter, dated June 1998, 6 months before she was diagnosed with cancer, my mother wrote that she knew I would inherit what she had inherited, and that the inheritance was both a gift and a burden. She wrote that I would have to make a choice, the same choice she had made, which was whether to live in the human world pretending to be fully human, or to acknowledge the other half of what I was and find a way to honor it. She wrote that there was no wrong choice, but there was a cost to both, and the cost of pretending was loneliness, and the cost of acknowledging was isolation. She said she had chosen loneliness because she had me and Dennis and a life that felt stable enough to justify the parts she kept hidden. She said I might choose differently, and that was okay. She said the ones in the woods would know me when I was ready to be known, and they would accept me or they would not. But either way, I was still her son, and I was exactly what I was supposed to be. I drove to the Koyukuk the next morning. I had not been back in 3 years, but I knew the route by memory. Every turn, every mile marker, every pothole in the gravel road. I parked at the pull-off, walked the trail, and entered the clearing just as the sun was going down. I did not build a fire. I just sat on the ground in the center of the clearing, wearing the bone necklace, holding the folder with my genetic test results, and I waited. The presence came within an hour, closer than it had ever been. I could hear it breathing, could hear the soft sound of its feet on the moss, could smell the scent of earth and fur. And then I heard a voice, not a human voice, but not an animal sound either. It was low, resonant, and it formed a sound that might have been a word or might have been a question. I said, "My name is Marcus. My mother was Elizabeth. You knew her." The breathing stopped, and then I felt it. The same hand on my shoulder that I had felt 7 years earlier. But this time I turned around. It was standing 3 feet away, 8 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that was thick on its chest and arms and thinner on its face. The face was broad, flat, with a heavy brow ridge and a nose that was wide but not protruding. The eyes were dark, almost black, and they looked at me with an intelligence that was unmistakable. It was not a human, but it was not an animal. It was something else, something older, and it was looking at me the way you look at family. I did not move. It reached out slowly, deliberately, and it touched my face the way my mother had described in her letter. The hand was warm, the palm was rough, and the touch was gentle. And then it made a sound, a low hum that vibrated in my chest, and I felt in that moment what my mother must have felt. Recognition. Belonging. Home. We stood there for maybe 10 minutes. It did not speak, and I did not speak because there were no words that would have made sense. and then it stepped back, turned, and walked into the trees. I called after it. I said, "Will I see you again?" It stopped. It did not turn around, but it raised one hand, and it made the same hum, and then it was gone. I have seen it twice since then, once in 2015 and once last year. Each time, the encounter has been brief, deliberate, and without explanation. It does not owe me explanations. It does not owe me anything, but it knows me and I know it, and that is enough. My name is Marcus Whiteriver. I am 52 years old. I live in a cabin outside Talkeetna, Alaska, and I carry in my blood the genetic legacy of a species that science does not acknowledge and that most people believe is a myth. I am 11% something that is not human, and I am learning to be okay with that. My mother was right. I am exactly what I am supposed to be, a bridge, a living reminder that the boundaries we draw around what is possible are arbitrary and incomplete. I do not talk about this. I do not share the lab results or the letters or the stone that sits on my desk. This story is the first time I have put any of it into words that another person might hear, and I am doing it now because I am 52 and time is not infinite. And there are others out there who might be reading this or listening to this and recognizing themselves in it. If you have ever felt like you do not quite fit, like your body is capable of things that other people's bodies are not, like the woods call to you in a way that feels less like recreation and more like return, you might be one of us. You might be carrying markers in your DNA that trace back to something older than cities, older than agriculture, older than the idea that humans are the only intelligent species on this continent. If that is true, you have a choice. You can ignore it, live a normal life, and die without ever acknowledging what you are. Or you can go into the woods, sit in the silence, and wait. They will find you. They know who you are. They have always known. And when they find you, you will understand what I understand now, which is that you are not alone. You have never been alone. And the secret your ancestors kept is not a burden, it is a gift. The woods are deeper than you think, and there are hands in the darkness that are waiting to welcome you home.